Thank you so much. Is that good there? Yeah. Thanks. Wow, look at this. It's completely full here. This is my second time in Wellington. I very much appreciate being here. Thank you, everybody, to the invite. It's a long flight from Berlin, and you kind of have to worry that it's like a little bit like, it's got to be really worth it. And so I hope this is worth it. Hold your laughs. That's the last one for a little while. Because I'm here, this is a eulogy for cyberspace. This is a eulogy for a world that we were promised but never lived in. We were told that there'd be no more forgetting, that the cloud would remember everything, and that cyberspace would liberate us. We were promised abundance of digital memory, of a permanence that would exist that was just a hard drive away, or a floppy disk, or a tape, or a USB key. Doesn't matter. Everything on the computer was too important to be forgotten, no matter the media or the medium. How we described ourselves, how we modeled the world, the things we said to each other, all of it online, all of it given some kind of sacredness and infused with opportunity. But in reality, the cloud was someone else's computer. That's that famous slogan, right? A risk that we said was sure, but acceptable. It's infrastructure, right? So that's fine. Mix electricity with complexity, and you've got memory. You reinvented the memory. And we said at the time, they said at the time, we think you're going to love it. In 1996, a guy named Barlow even went to Davos in Switzerland and told the Clinton-era world that he was declaring the independence of cyberspace. He said, "We will create a civilization of the mind in cyberspace. Governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. But you have neither solicited nor received ours. We did not invite you. You do not know us, nor do you know our world. Your kind is not welcome here." A civilization, new and unburdened, wholly dependent on endless electricity, endless parts, and endless labor. Ungovernable and stateless, yet forever suckling the teat of real-world power grids, erected within the borders of real-world states. A kind of claim to permanence and ephemera. That's making bumping noise, I'll put that here. That was confused from the start. A perfect rhetoric to kick off the digital revolution. It's really simple. You treat physical infrastructure as tangible, fragile, precarious, and real and immaterial. But at the same time, it's also the contents that are copyable, unstable, constantly degrading. We treat those like stone tablets from God himself. We treat the rest of the world as though it doesn't exist to fulfill these dreams. But that's not really how it works. The server is a machine with a fan and a memory disk and a maximum operating temperature. It is furnished with the parts and materials that are sourced so violently, so cruelly. Every server, every router, every phone in this room likely carries the debris of that raft. A fragment of a child worker's severed limb, a fingernail or a drop of blood, or the fur of a terrified creature machined into it. So no, cyberspace will never be left alone by the real world, because that's impossible. The servers are not safe, and they are not good. The servers are flooding, and they're on fire. And they're being bought and sold, and they are targets. And when they go dark, right now, so do we. We've built this entire civilization on an unthinkably brutal and comically unreliable stack, while hallucinating as literally anything but. We condemn AI today. I mean, I'm sure you're all on LinkedIn and heard the conversations about whether AI is an expertise or not. We condemn AI for hallucinating, but what does that make us? Building on a fantasy just as brittle, just as confidently wrong. All of this to pretend that a file is just a gesture that doesn't disappear in an instant, and that the server is anything but ephemeral. Barlow's cyberspace dream was a stillborn, and he pronounced its sovereignty in Davos At the same time, the US government quietly laid claim to it back home, the very same day. At least GPT can be corrected. Barlow stuck to that myth till the day he died. California has a lot to fucking answer for. I can pinpoint the exact moment I saw the violence at the heart of the digital. And this is a story I've never told before. It's in 2014 in Hawaii. So 6 months prior, I was this bored kid in Melbourne, LARPing as a creative director and pushing Photoshop files to an obscure GitHub repo as a volunteer. And then I found myself on another set of occupied land. I'd been flown to unceded Kakana Maoli land. I'd been flown into Hawaii to help finish this secure messaging app that's going to be called Signal. The boss, Moxie Marlinspike, is the glue of this project, a Steve Jobs type with dreadlocks and anarchist leanings, and we're all camped in an off-season mansion that we've hired. It's all wicker furniture and a private beach that nobody swims at. That's supposed to keep looping. Sorry. At night, I'm arguing with Moxie because his threat models and his assumptions about phone numbers as user accounts really bother me. I tell him this app is going to get used by people who are going to be escaping intimate partner violence, so you need to let them in with pseudonyms. They can't have connections via their phone numbers. But he insists on ensuring that address book syncing works as smooth as butter. In the mornings, the Pacific hammers the beach like it's trying to get at us. And I try to work out how I can get Moxie to listen to me. Late that week, Moxie rolls back my best interface with a shrug while I stand right in front of him. He is the first person I meet in this kind of position who can look at the risk and simply not see it. We're too late for Snowden, obviously, and Manning, they come before us. But we're also too soon for whoever's next. But this version, after those who whistle blew before them, this version's worse than what we've started with, and it's got the potential to really hurt. By the end of the week, I'm done. I love the people I'm working with. They're a team who can force silicon, lithium, and code to bend political reality. But I can't stand the compromises that we have made in the name of this hubris. I slip out before dawn, no goodbyes. I take a 30-minute flight back to Honolulu. My flight to Australia isn't for another 24 hours, and I'm too angry to really care about that. So I flip open Airbnb, and I tap the first option. It's like a bunk bed on a yacht for $40 US a night. When I arrive at 6:30 that morning, the boat's owner greets me. She's a sun-blasted Californian, you know the type. Leathery, late 60s, perfect teeth, blonde hair. She apologizes. She and her husband have decided to take the boat out for the day, and she'll pay any hotel I want. Top shelf, bohemian, hostel, doesn't matter. No limit for the inconvenience if I'd rather cancel. And then she pauses, and she says, unless you want to come with us. I'm one step ahead of you, lady. I know what daily sailing prices start at. It's in the thousands. The idea that my $40 bunk bed just turned into a private cruise, that's like Airbnb 2014, baby. I'm in. She beams, and she hands me a Ziploc bag of boiled egg sandwiches. She already knew I'd say yes. Because, I mean, right. So behind the wheel of the boat, because I don't know anything about boating terms, it's her partner, and he's this grayer than hospital cafeteria pepper shaker hair, but he's built like an infantryman. He's warm but distant. He gives me a stern nod when I get on the boat with approval, like I'm about to ask permission to marry his daughter. He's the captain today, and a test drive for his friend and someone who looks like they're going to buy the boat. This guy in cargo pants, polo shirt, roughly the same age, rail thin, pale. We motor out of the harbor, and we lose cell coverage almost immediately. By 7:30, we're several kilometers away offshore. The sun is razor bright, but it's so gentle on my skin. I've never felt anything like it. I mean, I'm from Australia. I've never felt anything like that before. The water is so clear, I can count ridges in the sand 30 meters beneath me. It's alive down there. It's so alive down there. And it's so gorgeous. In Australia, here, all these places, but it's so gorgeous, and specifically that Pacific way. Once the engine settles and the two men recline in their seats, they start to bond like all American dads do over their tech jobs, their tours, and their tenacity for the hustle. Both work in Honolulu, I learned. They won't say where, but it's tech, probably intelligence. They might as well be brothers at this point. They talk of their tours. Both served in Vietnam, and that's a big deal. They both rattle off company names, tour dates, regions, same vintage, different billets. One's the Army Corps engineer, and the other's a field medic. But it's their tenacity where they're most eager to share. The captain, the boat owner's partner, goes first, and he talks about how after the war ended, he returned under contract, and he rebuilt the very roads he and his countrymen had created. He won an exclusive reconstruction contract covering all of the roads in Saigon. It's the highlight of his career, he says, and it sets him up for life. The buyer prospect nods and beams with approval. He and his brother, a civil surgeon, have set up a logistics firm on the West Coast. They've bought obsolete prosthetics, pediatric limbs at scrap prices and shipped them back to Vietnam by the containerful. Fitted thousands of kids probably, maybe hundreds of thousands. The country paid for them all. From the front of the deck, I eavesdrop. They fold these stories unwittingly into this familiar Silicon Valley refrain, make the world a better place. Good people, well paid, acted properly, absolute in their unwavering belief in their good. The fish dance below in the clearest ocean I've ever seen in my life. And despite of this gracious light, I feel this true evil on this boat with me. These men, they're not aberrations. They're a template that I've seen everywhere, saying the same words I'd heard all week at the mansion, the same words I'd heard at the copycat San Francisco subplant co-working spaces of Melbourne, Sydney's Silicon Beaches, Berlin's Silicon Alley, and Apple's developer conferences. Violence, then rebuild. Profit, then philanthropy. Repeat. Different war, same business model. New interface, same shining eyes. Making the world a better place. And as I sit there on the boat, I suddenly see clearly the next 20 years in front of me. Automated war, digital rights, managed food, not so precision strikes. They all come at me with the same morally coded entrepreneurship, the thing I've been arguing about. Pseudonyms, safety, friction. In Hawaii, all of it doesn't matter because it lives downstream from this mindset. Because tech wants a smooth path to scale, even if that path is laid over someone else's ruins. We're building a new home for the mind, Barlow says, making the world a better place. On that boat, and with nowhere else to go and no signal, that logic short-circuits something in me. Nothing dramatic, just a clean snap. 3 months later, the former head of the National Security Agency, General Michael Hayden, goes on cable news and says, we kill people based on metadata. We shape our tools, and then our tools shape us. Marshall McLuhan's resonant response for the 20th century's explosion in platforms is super resonant today. But in networked environments, tools observe and shape us beyond momentary interactions. The mesh of network devices around us generate testimony that can outlast memory, intent, or even life itself. When General Hayden spoke of the metadata killings in 2014, he was referring to targeted assassins, but it would soon come home. In 2015, a man named Victor Collins was found dead in a man named James Bates' bathtub in Bentonville, Arkansas. Originally, this was treated as a regular homicide, which is a weird sentence, but stick with me. Bates' home was smart. Water, electricity, heat, all networked, changing the investigation's nature. Connected to an Amazon Alexa, all controllable via a network. And while the media fixated on his Amazon Echo, maybe in a tabloid fantasy of captured screams from the deceased, it was actually the smart water meter and the thermostat logs that the investigators started to look at. Bates's meter showed a 140 gallons use discrepancy between 1 and 3 a.m., which they interpreted as a cleanup. The thermostat records reinforced this narrative, noting manual temperature changes in activity. Together, these systems undermined Bates' alibi. He claimed he was asleep. The data, and only the data, suggested otherwise. The charges were eventually dropped, but the implications were clear. Our tools observe us, creating forensic sensing record behavior anomalies without consent or awareness. A generative layer projecting state authority into everyday life. Every home becomes a node in a datafied evidentiary web, a site of ambient accountability. And this is where I work. I don't fit neatly into the roles such as like a policy advisor or a traditional technologist. My work draws from digital security, vulnerability research, adversarial threat modeling, things like that. But what I do differently is I apply it as a cultural diagnostic. My team and I map power, observing systems whose stated purposes diverge from their structural function. In 2022, we released a report called Memory in Uncertainty, documenting how preservation is under threat from its own belief systems. And to understand how this all works and how it's related, we have to go back to the Industrial Revolution, the early 19th century. Policing here in London explicitly controlled stock workers in the name of capital itself. To paraphrase historian Peter Leinberg, and I had a bigger one, but I've got time here. The origin of police in England is to be found not as crime prevention, but in the class war of capital and a discipline of the poor. I mean, this is classic Marxist criticism as well, right? But if the machine itself is a catalyst for worker rights and thusly modern policing, the industrial machine and its invention, the introduction of successive technologies under capital shows this logic repeating ever accelerating epoch of boom, extract, and force. Another example. Automobiles promised autonomy and freedom of movement. By the 1960s, urban infrastructure has completely reshaped itself around cars. Highways are built, suburbs are built, things are demolished, signposts go up, streets are widened, areas of public foot traffic are shortened. But by the time we get to the 2010s, the end of the century, you get compliance, driver's license scanners, breathalyzers, demerit points, these sorts of things. Boom, extract, and enforce. So let's take a look at the digital. Initially decentralized and liberating, the digital network mutates into surveillance capitalism. It reorganizes social and cultural interaction into measurable patterns of extraction. Those platforms become states within states. You've got your Facebooks, your Twitter, things like that. Every gesture, from a swipe to a search, becomes material for prediction, monetization, and control. I mean, we know this, right? Like we talk about it all the time. Today, though, this logic becomes fully militarized. Regimes from Iran to the United States weaponize digital infrastructure to track, punish, and isolate. Boom, extract, and force. Each infrastructure in this cycle begins with the promise of stability, but stability calcifies eventually into compliance through legal policy, economic incentives, or embedded technical defaults. Unlike other mediums, the digital requires capital just to exist. No part of it is passive. Every element, electricity, hardware supply chains, software maintenance, protocols, transmission, the display, your own laptop, must be actively maintained by someone, somewhere, continuously. There is no such thing as an inert digital object. As archivists in this room, you probably understand this more than anyone. You already know this. That's why a single broken dependency or an unplugged server or a licensing change is catastrophic and collapses an entire memory system. It's also why every uncritical archive project risks becoming a future liability of compliance, a target or a weapon waiting for legal reinterpretation. And so I ask, how do we keep neutrality in this medium that punishes existence without upkeep? This is the politics of capital enforced at the material layer.
レイン、ずいぶん慣れてきたようだね。ワイヤードとの付き合い。
うん。
一つだけ忠告しておこう。
え？
ワイヤードはあくまでも情報を伝達し、 コミュニケーションするための空間、リアルワールドと混同してはいけない。忠告の意味、わかるかな？
違うよ。
え？
そんなに教会ってきちんとしてないみたいだよ。もうすぐ中に入れるんだよ。フルレンジ、フルモーションで私をメタファライズさせて。
しかし
心配しないで。私は私だもの。
そうかな。
There's a reason this moment in 90s J-pop culture is still lodged in the zeitgeist. The main character, Lane, says, "You're wrong. The border between the two, the wired and the real, is not that clear. I'll translate myself into it." What Lane understands, and what her father refuses to, is that the scene was never real. The network was never outside. It always bled. In my work, we call that bleed the parareal, a state like being in an eclipse where digital and material, the conditions align just long enough for the light of the rest of the world to vanish. You've felt it, I know you have. It's the ghost touch. If you've ever played VR, you ever put a VR headset on and felt someone touch you while you're in VR. Phantom touch. Or, probably more likely, the impossible fatigue of a Zoom call while you're on it. See, I knew that yeah, that's the universal condition. But it's also the targeted ad that just gets it just right, to the point where you look at the sidebar of a website, you see it and you go, whoa. The parareal emerges in these moments, an ambient, personal free-fall is condition, emotional, destabilizing, immune to control. It's unharnessable, it can't be measured, it arrives before explanation. The parareal is what slips through before the cybernetic digestion is done. And it happens despite the fact that the servers we use for speech also hold the power bills. The models that predict weather also train on war. The apps we carry on our memories on are run on materials pulled from dead rivers and darker hands. In 2021, a data center in Stuttgart burnt to the ground, taking all of its backups with it. In Paris, a main switch explodes, threatening months of art restoration archives with it. In Kiev, the citizenship system was wiped by the Ukrainian government to stop Russian takeover. In Austin and Dallas, data center cooling systems fail in boom-bust heatwave and snowstorm cycles 6 months apart. In Hong Kong, the threat of a trade firewall strands an entire generation of visual culture across an air gap that nobody dares to cross. Amongst other things, I count data center losses because I need to know what it means when memory dies in the present tense. We pretend these are technical events, but we know that they're physiological. Each is like the burning of a little library of Alexandria. They hit you in the gut. They hurt just as much as coming home and finding it destroyed. Except here, instead of debris, what you have is total absence. That thump in the chest, the moment that something vanishes, and you just know. You just know. That's the parareal. A moment where your world and the network aligns just perfectly enough for the loss to hit you in both instances at the same time. Archivists in the room, you already work in the parareal. Every website you capture is a bet that the legal regime won't flip. Every object you scan is a bet that the viewing software works in perpetuity. Every checksum you verify is a prayer that the machine hasn't lied to you. You already know that permanence is theater. You just hope that the curtain doesn't drop on your watch. So I ask, why are we still designing like the seam is real? Why treat a server outage like it's spilt coffee and the reef collapse like it's an act of God when the same kind of heat is causing both of these at the same time? The digital is already real enough to bury us, but the parareal is where we choose whether that burial is silent. So, you want an example? Here's one. In October 2024, the Internet Archive was hacked. 31 million accounts exposed. The Wayback Machine, which you're probably familiar with, which tries to archive as much of the internet as possible, is taken offline. There is an indiscriminate memory of the internet that is defaced. The real reaches into the digital and gives it amnesia. I think it's really weird that in computer science, memory and storage are functionally interchangeable terms. Both describe containers that write data into. But this isn't really memory, is it? It's inventory. In software design, the term archive has been repurposed as soft delete. You archive a chat or an email. When a developer says archive, they mean out of sight. The logic is consistent. Accumulation equals knowledge, redundancy equals resilience, storage equals memory. A file written to disk is treated like a moment faithfully preserved. The machine is consistent. History is a payload, immutable and objective. But really, lived memory is neither. Memory carries consequence. Memory drifts, it distorts, it demands consent, it incurs risk. When the cost is unpaid, the result is not remembrance. Instead, it's just basically hoarding. What happens when you take memory in the computer science sense and you apply it to people? In April 2018, Verizon announced Tumblr, which is a social media site with blogs on it, very popular with youth and had like a massive adult content section for years. They announced an adult content purge as part of their acquisition of the company. Within hours, a small band of digital preservationists known as Archive Team spun up a 10 gigabyte per second scrape. When they connect to a site with a request not to archive on Tumblr, they just ignore it by default. Tumblr back then was, as I said, a teeming hub of left-of-center identity, hundreds of thousands of queer, trans, and sex work blogs, and they just took it all. Their images, posts, their connections, all shunted onto disks before their owners could even note the countdown banner. Asked about consent, the project lead, Jason Scott, was very blunt. Quote, "It's not our job to figure out what's valuable. We act on three virtues: rage, paranoia, and kleptomania. Rage at platform vandalism, paranoia that delay equals deletion, kleptomania as method, copy first, justify later. All three virtues work only when you are not the subject." The scrape, of course, was celebrated on tech forums. Zero-day cultural salvage, yes. 40 terabytes saved, heroes all round. But inside the target community, the reaction was very different. Blogs meant for small circles of people resurfaced on torrent indexes. Dead name chains became permanent search hits. Pathways to opt out were only made available after public backlash. Archive Team's ethos is consistent with its underlying code base. Memory is a payload, provenance is a checksum, risk is external. The crawler will save a genocide denial thread in the same zeal as a suicide prevention zine because both resolve to bytes. Zooming out, the ethos values time over as the only metric. Precarity of a data set is valued over the precarity of the author of the data. Jason Scott frames it simply. If you don't want people to have your data, don't put it online. Which is true, I guess, but it's also what happens when the computer science definition of memory meets living subjects. Just because the internet never forgets doesn't mean that you personally should be the arbiter of this attempt at immutability. This is a despicable worldview that guarantees bit-level integrity while stripping contextual agency. It solves for retention and calls the remainder history. Preservation framed as a rescue mission that collapses into extraction, a one-way suction of culture from precarious spaces into institutional cold storage. Loss is prevented, but harm is displaced. Memory is not a filed system, and the incriminative efforts of preservation risks becoming hoarding under the banner of permanence. We've already determined right now that this is a complete fabrication, and so file system logic cannot reconcile this. It counts objects and not consequences. So the wager stands. We report success while the whole communities that are archived go to ground. We have this thing. Copy now, apologize later, and just hope the future is kind. In 2025, ICE began monitoring archives and social media under the new violent administration, so this is not theoretical, the stakes are already here. Kim Stanley Robinson is an author of numerous books. And in the Years of Rice of Salt, I don't have enough time to give context for the quote, I'm very sorry. He writes in a character form, "My feeling is that until the number of whole lives is greater than the number of shattered lives, we remain stuck in some kind of prehistory, unworthy of humanity's great spirit." I really like that quote. We are not trapped by a lack of alternatives. We are trapped by a dominant logic that treats memory as data and culture as inventory. A worldview where storage is mistaken for remembrance, where survival is reduced to a backup, and where preservation of a copy is considered more important than the integrity of life. But there is a new class of memory work underway. It comes from people who have already survived collapse. The survivors, too, of things like the archive team's archive of Tumblr. People who have lived through it and are still here. And over the last 5 years of my work, I've seen it everywhere. A Tamil archive, posted on Instagram, but circulated through hands without a center, visible to its community, but vulnerable and immune at the same time to deletion by virtue of its refusal to centralize. The idea here is that the public broadcast is just that, a public broadcast, a canary in the coal mine of where the winds of culture and society are blowing at any one point in time. They're acutely aware of the platform's censorship, and critically, they build that risk into their practice. Or the furries, a canon where they document and archive their work with a stronger provenance than most institutional archives, stewarded through performative identity, distributed moderation, and a refusal to be indexed by systems that it does not trust. What's fascinating about that is the intimacy of that, combined with the fact that there are no real names anywhere. Or Gridism is an interpretive act of painting where you take game screenshots from precious moments with your friends that are ephemeral, and you paint them in real life as still life, interfaces and all, as a form of processing that renders a fleeting culture with some kind of presence. What they all have in common is that they rely on practices that aren't speculative, but highly savvy and operationalized. I'm going to go over a little bit, I'm sorry. They make visible a new ethic, one that begins with consent, not a checkbox, but also making that a foundational principle, rather than just like a feature set. Once you have consent at your core, they also assume that the server may not be there tomorrow, and they act accordingly. It also considers the right to disappear, to distort, to misremember, and they treat that as sacred. They preserve through adaptation and recalibrate after loss. They borrow from sneakernet techniques the idea of offline computer-to-computer transfer. They don't demand consent. In all stages, they begin with it. And so as the foundation falls out of our post-World War II world order, these are projects and people at the periphery who fall first. So, how do you recognize them? Well, you ask, do they function in blackout conditions? Do they demand consent before they remember? Can they forget? Do they allow for revision, distortion, or contradiction? How do they confront their antagonists? Do they even name them? What in their archive, what role does decay play? And most importantly, how much of the memory can be rebuilt by hand when all systems fail? This is the work of something that we're developing as a concept called exilic design, as in exile, exilic design. And it's what it means to inhabit the parareal as well. It also, fortunately, is a practice that can be applied. My collaborators and I are doing that right now. 5 years of dedicated work to protect our own accumulation from these principles, from these issues that we've seen that I talked about at the start. We care because we know that when the server goes dark, memory becomes a question of who gets to decide what still matters. And if you don't build that answer yourself, someone else will and has. And we lose the ability to, and the right to be remembered on our own terms. And we lose the ability to carry each other across collapse. And we lose the ability by mistaking it for a backup. And unless we build memory systems that are willing to risk forgetting, we will lose something more than data. The archive was never neutral. Born from the Western academic and kleptomaniac practice of and desire to collect, the immutable digital archive is a tool for consolidation. It's a weapon, a marketplace, a machine for freezing narrative. And unless we build memory systems that are willing to risk forgetting, we will lose something more than data. We were told that digital would remember everything, that cyberspace was sovereign. that metadata was harmless, that archives were neutral, that the cloud would always be here. I think by now, it's safe to say that myth is dead, but the body remains unburied, animated by venture capital and institutional cowardice. As I speak, every phone in this room is dutifully mirroring this room to a distant server. It's the same thing. Put it online, it'll live forever. An undeserved optimism engineered into a form of hoarding, marketed as memory and policeable as hell to make the world a better place. But as I said, there is a new class of memory work underway. It doesn't come from Barlow, it doesn't come from software as a service, it certainly doesn't come from Jason Scott. It was born from technologies that resist purity politics. The idea of not engaging with a digital system because it doesn't fit your requirements entirely. It's not a solution and it doesn't scale. But instead it emerges from compromise from the contained system itself. It names its threats. It negotiates what risks it will carry. It refuses clean exits and easy promises. It prepares for attack and collapse. Those who embrace it do so because they already have no other choice. And in many cases, what emerges now is something entirely new, and more importantly, entirely invisible to most people in this room. But the thing is, all of us have been made to step into the wired. It's time we faced it. We watched metadata be used to end lives. We've watched the climate knock data centers off the map. We've watched the Internet Archive hacked and defaced. We've watched its allies vacuum the intimacies of queer youth without consent. And we now watch our allies over the pond as they frog march themselves off a datafied fascist cliff. There are exits everywhere, but you need to build them yourself. You might ask yourself, who will remember us when the servers go dark? But maybe the better question is, who will we entrust to remember? Don't forget, I will be giving a workshop on this tomorrow, Wednesday. And so thank you, NDF, and everybody in this room, for your generous invitation to speak and for being here and giving me your attention. Thank you. We're going to do... Yeah.
Tēnā rawa ata ko, Cade. That was a wonderful talk. Would you like to have a microphone? Please say yes. Otherwise, this is not going to go well.
Okay.
Excellent. You mentioned there your workshop on Wednesday, which is Cultural Memory at the End of History.
That's right.
Would you like to say a little bit about how that workshop connects to what we talked about today? Oh, before you do, we're going to have a Q&A. Please submit your questions to be answered via Slido.
Okay. So the first thing I'll do is I'll answer why it is a workshop at the end of history. So short answer is it's a concept, a neoliberal concept. It emerges in the 90s when the Soviet Union falls that, well, there's no more threats. Everything will stay the same for the rest of history, the end of history. And I like to think of ourselves as living through the end of history. Because I think that's like essentially what it sounds like. And I think that's a really important way of thinking about it because it's a really nice way to remind ourselves that we have to challenge the idea of like what structurally will remain after this period that we're in now. And if you kind of call it the end of history, then you kind of can start to think about evaluating everything on its own terms. The workshop itself, though, is, so I mentioned at the end that we've done 5 years of this work. I won't go too much into it because it's not really important in the topic of what we're talking about today, but we are building our own research tools as part of this. And so we have been working very hard to embody these ideas I talked about here in a way that we can then make sense of the world, this like overwhelming world in a new way, whilst also simultaneously not having these issues, like not falling victim to the archive. Right? And it's 5 years worth of work. I mean, the complexity that we deal with is really intense. So it's very hard to sort of move between those. And also, more importantly, we work with a lot of very vulnerable people. Vulnerability here not just being like queer communities or things like that, but we've also worked with like members of the intelligence community who have talked to us directly about how they see things in the world. You know, sometimes in an unsanctioned way. So the vulnerability is across the board. What matters is that that we're able to provide a rigorous structure that allows us to both work exactly in the modern context with emerging technologies and things like that in good ways, if we can, but also simultaneously be entrusted with the stuff that's given to us.
Excellent. Thank you. And there are, I believe, the last few spots going in that workshop, if you want to get on the NDF25 website. Had a question come in. Could you speak a little more to the idea of exilic design in memory work, and how that applies to archives and libraries, especially to the people in this room?
Absolutely. So exilic design, as a buffer, I will say, like, this is a concept I've been developing more recently. I've been going through this pretty intense start to the year where there's been a lot of instability in my organization from outside forces. And that, that realization that there is a kind of, that structures can fall over very quickly means that when we first started the organization, when we first started NDC, it was very much like we're going to be purists about things. And that was very difficult to maintain when things started to slide off the rails. I already knew, from 2014 that sort of what I felt was coming based on like these conversations that I'd been seeing and then the subsequent issues after that. But exilic design is really this concept of like embracing things like the fact that the things that you're building are automatically contaminated, for example, and then being able to map that contamination and then either route around it or find other ways to deal with it straight away. Typically what we do when we build systems right now, or we design systems, we might buy a piece of software or get a piece of open source tooling, and then just kind of like that then shapes our own practice, right? So like, this is everything from like Microsoft Excel to like dedicated archival software. It really, like, to borrow Marshall McLuhan, we shape our tools, then our tools shape up. We're well and truly being shaped by these tools, right? Like, and the idea here is to kind of use that and see it as an adversarial lens and try to like push back against that, right? And to also do so whilst at the same time being aware that you can't just like, you can't be precious about it, right? You have to be like, have a kind of militant pragmatism to your work and understand that like, you're not going to be a reformist, you have to be sort of a structuralist critic, but at the same time, you can't then allow yourself to be compromised by inaction, by not going for technologies, right? And so exilic design is really about navigating those and turning those pitfalls and those challenges into like a framework that you can then identify proactively and sort of hit some of these issues before they arise and before they entrench in them. Yeah.
Thank you.
Good question, whoever. Good question, Mr. or Mrs. Anonymous. Thank you.
10 points. I forgot to say there's points. On a similar sort of thinking about like actively working against points of failure because you assume that they're working against you, is it possible to protect a digital collection better than a physical one? Sort of objects that are either born digital or have been captured digitally compared to, I don't know, a train, or are the objects that are digital because they're stored on physical hardware, therefore also physical objects?
So that's a good question as well. The kind of short answer is that there's people in this room who will be probably thinking that like it's actually quite easy to protect a digital collection better than a physical one because it's portable, you can move it very quickly out of the way, things like that. And that's true. So it's not a black and white yes or no binary answer, right? But there are ways in which they aren't easy to protect. If we play, this is very sneaky, if you play with the definition of who are we trying to protect? Are we protecting the digital collection itself? Are we protecting it from weaponization or illegitimate use? Are we protecting it from extractivism? These sorts of things. In almost all cases, the digital collection, aside from its portability, and ease of backup and replication. In all other cases, it's actually more vulnerable, right? It's very vulnerable to extraction, it's very vulnerable to weaponization, and more importantly, it's extremely vulnerable to destruction in those moments because all it takes, again, is like you have a file, like a piece of malware. I mean, the Internet Archive example is a really great one. But more than that, I think this one is the least understood idea, is when you have a digital collection, it means some a-hole from the state I'm not an anti-statist, I'm just talking about like surveillance people, right? Like some person who's like trying to build a narrative on someone gets to sit in an office and like build that narrative out really nicely. In a physical collection, they gotta actually do work. And the best defense against surveillance is making investigators do work. So yeah, I mean, that's a complicated answer, but that's basically it, yeah.
Thank you. You touched on the parareal, which is something that is happening whether we plan for it or not. Is it possible or useful to prepare for the parareal, to plan for those sort of moments, or what's the word I'm looking for? Confluences, there we go, I went to uni. Especially if it's beyond the reach of the regime of accountability.
Become a furry. No, but yes, and furry, like the furry concept is part of this. So what's interesting about furries, and I'll get to this question, but I'll just like link it back to this. So the other big project that we do is...
I reject the term that there's only one thing that's interesting about furries.
And what is that?
Sorry, you said that there's one thing that's interesting about furries.
Oh, I meant like in this context.
Yes,
but it was going to sound like I was going off topic, and I was like, I'm going to warn you, I'm going to sound like I'm off topic, but like Adam Curtis, I'm going to draw it back into a
I'm with
fantastic
you.
conclusion.
We're on a journey.
Okay, good. All right. So one of the other pieces of work that we do is on digital identity. We actually have this really huge report coming out very soon on digital identity that looks at the past, present, and future of digital identity from the lens that digital identity creates brittle societies. And I mean, just a quick example, social engineering attacks, which no digital identity protects us from, is a great example of this and the kind of snowball effect of that. So, example, everybody in this room has heard about how banks have, like, people get defrauded by making payments to somebody, and then the bank is like, well, that was you that did that, so we're not going to like refund that money. Like, that's kind of illegal, and through all of history, that's been very illegal. It's been up to the bank to verify your identity. Now that's flipped, right, through digital identity. So like that tears at the very fabric of society, right? When you have a digitized society and it's highly weaponizable, then every attempt to like fake the identity system it makes people paranoid, right? And so what's interesting about the furries is that they live in performative identity. Instead of having they have high trust networks of people, often very intimate networks of people, but not always, and they do commerce, they transact, they spend thousands of dollars on fursuits, like costumes, and they build games together, they like go into business together, they start conventions together. If you were an artist, one of our earliest pieces of work, we found that if you were an artist during the pandemic and you were in the UK, you were far more likely to be sliding into poverty during that period of lockdown than if you were a comparably skilled furry artist. And that's because the furries have a like circular economy. It's not because they're rich. It is because they have the same socioeconomic brackets, and there's data to back that up. But instead, it's because they have intertwined their art practice and their sort of understanding of digitized technologies and archives and these sorts of systems with performative identity, right? And that's kind of the parareal being cultivated directly, because when you get a piece of art, you've designed a character, then you say, this is a performative set of traits and an aesthetic that represents the best version of me that I identify with. Then you give that to an artist over in another country or in another, somewhere off in the world, and that person parses your identity, your performative identity, through their own lens, and then they give you a piece of artwork back. And in that moment, there's a validation there that is super parareal, right? So that's an example of the parareal. But again, like, the parareal's been around a long time. If we remember, back in 2007, you had like kids going off to fight or be married into ISIS. Like, that's a memory hole that people keep forgetting. Every time I bring this up, people are like, oh yeah, that happened. Really horrible concept. And it was because in early YouTube, they were basically radicalizing kids on YouTube. But the parareal is the moment before that, right? The parareal is when you've got a kid online who's kind of like super unhappy with their conditions, right? Their material conditions. And what they get is like a solid critique, even though it's like it's solid in the context of like convincing, not like that I agree with ISIS. Wait.
This whole interview was a trap. We got him, boys.
Just splice that and put it on YouTube, and that's all over. But seriously, like, it's the precursor. Like, no wonder things turned out they did with like QAnon and conspiracy theorists and things like that. I mean, it was happening as early as 2005. It was happening the day YouTube started, right? But the thing to remember with that is that, like, in that moment, you're cultivating the parareal. In that case, it's a scattershot. What you're doing is you're like, what is the zeitgeist? And then you're putting content out and hoping that you like ping people as they're in the parareal and just get to them, right? But the parareal itself is like, the definition of it is that it's this powerful agent for change. Another final example I'll give you is just like when you have live streamers, and a live streamer has like a big audience, and then they have like people who have like parasocial relationships with them, where they like think that the streamer is like their best friend, and they know all about the streamer, but the streamer obviously is like this 1 of 1,000, 10,000 people who watch the stream. Like that's the parareal too, but in the delusion of the viewer, not in the streamer, right? So the idea here is that like the one-way relationship that you think is reciprocal is an example of like this sort of your lived conditions, in a sense, the desire, I guess, for attention or validation or whatever sort of like affirmation that you're looking for in that kind of parasocial cultivation. That is an example of the parareal. So yeah, I mean, I just gave 3 really bad examples, like sad examples, but it's not always bad. Yeah.
Well, that flows to our last question, which is there any right side to all this? Yes or no?
Can I be really, like, glib?
Sure. I do.
Okay, here we go. Well, hire me and then yes.
Everybody, Cade Diehm. Thank you so much, Cade. This is a little token of our thanks for coming such a long way to talk to us. Thank you so much, Cade.